The silence following the final piano chords was deafening, more so than any applause Helen had ever received. And in that moment, before a standing audience of 2,000 executives, she finally understood she'd spent 15 years burying the one thing that truly made her feel alive. But to understand how a 52-year-old cleaning lady managed to stop an entire business convention dead in its tracks with just her voice, we need to go back 3 weeks, when Helen Montgomery still believed her greatest talent was being invisible. It was a gray July Tuesday when the CEO of Martinelli and Associates first set foot on the 12th floor of the office building where Helen had worked for 8 years. Richard Martinelli, a 45-year-old man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and closing million-dollar deals, had never noticed the gray-haired woman who cleaned his office every night. To him, Helen was just another element of the infrastructure, like the air conditioning or the internet connection, something that functioned silently so his life could flow without obstacles. That morning, however, Richard arrived earlier than usual and found Helen still finishing up in his office. She had her back to him, humming a tune he couldn't quite place, but which had something familiar and comforting about it. Her voice, even a whisper, held a purity that made him pause at the doorway, unannounced. "Excuse me," he said, louder than necessary, causing Helen to jump and drop her cleaning solution on the floor. The blue liquid spread across the marble floor as Helen quickly knelt to clean up the mess, murmuring apologies under her breath. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the shame of being caught making noise during work. "I was just finishing up, Mr. Martinelli. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience." Richard watched the woman on her knees, frantically cleaning the spilled product, and felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was a distant memory of his own mother doing the exact same thing when he was a child and knocked something over. "It's all right," he said, softer. "No need to apologize." But Helen had already finished cleaning and left the room, pushing her cleaning cart and leaving only the scent of lavender in the air. Richard stood there for a few minutes, trying to remember the melody she'd been humming, but his phone rang and routine swallowed him whole again. Helen, meanwhile, went down to the basement where the cleaning staff's locker room was located, her heart still racing. It wasn't the first time she'd felt small in front of one of the building's executives, but something about this encounter had disturbed her differently. Maybe it was the way he'd looked at her, not with disdain or indifference, but with a curiosity she couldn't interpret. While changing out of her uniform, Helen avoided looking at the clouded mirror in the locker room. She'd learned over the years that mirrors were dangerous for people like her. They showed too much, the deepening wrinkles, the fading hair, the dreams slowly dissolving into echoes of a distant youth. At 52, Helen had built a life based on invisibility. She woke at 4 in the morning, took 2 buses to get downtown, worked from 6 to 2 cleaning offices, and returned to her small apartment in the East End, where she shared space with her 28-year-old daughter, Julia, who worked as a receptionist at a veterinary clinic. Julia didn't know her mother had once been different. She didn't know that Helen Montgomery, before becoming Helen the cleaner, had been Helen Souza, a 24-year-old who sang in bars and dreamed of recording an album. She didn't know that the voice now only manifesting itself in quiet humming during work had once made dozens of people cry with emotion on small stages scattered across the city. This transformation had begun when Julia was born. The girl's father, a musician who had promised the world, disappeared when he learned of the pregnancy, leaving Helen alone with a baby to raise and bills to pay. Night work in bars became incompatible with motherhood, and Helen had to choose between her voice and her daughter. The choice was obvious, but that didn't make the sacrifice any less painful. For years she tried to juggle small daytime jobs with occasional nighttime performances, but reality was implacable. Opportunities were scarce, money was tight, and Julia needed stability. Gradually, Helen silenced her voice until it became only a memory that visited her in sleepless nights, when she hummed lullabies to her sleeping daughter. The cleaning job at the company came when Julia turned 15. Helen answered a newspaper ad and was hired the same day, not for her qualifications, which were few, but for the punctuality and dedication she demonstrated from the interview. 8 years later, she had become part of the building's furniture, a constant and comforting presence that no one really saw, but everyone would miss if she disappeared. In the days following her encounter with Richard, Helen noticed he started arriving earlier at the office. Not every day, but frequently enough for her to notice the pattern. Sometimes, he'd arrive while she was still cleaning the conference room, and he always found an excuse to pass by, to retrieve a forgotten document, check if the printer was working, or simply grab coffee from the hallway machine. Helen felt uncomfortable with this new routine. She had perfected the art of being ignored, and the sudden attention made her nervous. She stopped humming while working and started cleaning the rooms in complete silence, but she realized that this somehow disappointed Richard. One morning, he finally broke the tension. "You have a beautiful voice," he said, without preamble, while Helen was cleaning the conference table. She stopped and looked at him, surprised. "Excuse me, that song you were singing last week, it was beautiful. Did you compose it?" Helen felt her face flush. No one had commented on her voice in years, not even Julia, who had grown up accustomed to her mother's songs and no longer paid attention to them. "No, sir. It was just an old song." "What's it called?" Helen hesitated. The song was Aguas de Marcho, by Tom Jobim, but she had created her own interpretation, slower and more melancholic, which she used to sing when she felt nostalgic. She decided to use a more readily understood title. "March Waters," she said, returning to cleaning. "Do you sing professionally?" The question fell like a stone in Helen's stomach. She stopped again, this time looking directly at Richard, with an expression he couldn't decipher. There was pain there, but also something like defiance. "I clean offices professionally, Mr. Martinelli." The tone was drier than Helen intended, and she immediately regretted it. She couldn't afford to be impolite to a client, especially not the company owner. But Richard didn't seem offended. On the contrary, there was something in his eyes that suggested understanding. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to pry." Helen shook her head, softening her expression. "It's okay. It's just, that was a long time ago." They were silent for a few seconds, a silence filled with unspoken things. Then Richard picked up his briefcase and headed for the door. "You know," he said, stopping in the doorway, "my company is organizing a convention next week. We'll be receiving executives from various multinational corporations. It's an important event for us." Helen nodded, not understanding where he was going with this. "The problem is that the singer we had hired canceled at the last minute. Health problems. And now we're without entertainment for the gala dinner." Helen's heart began to beat faster, but she forced herself to keep a neutral expression. "That's a shame," she said. "It is," Richard agreed. "Especially because it was supposed to be something intimate, you know. Not a big production, but something that would touch people, something real." He paused, looking directly at her. "You wouldn't be interested, by any chance?" Helen felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. For a moment she couldn't form words. Mr. Martinelli, I don't think about it," he said gently. "It's just a song, maybe two, for an audience that would truly appreciate something authentic." And with that, he left, leaving Helen alone in the meeting room, with the cleaning cloth still in her hands and a whirlwind of emotions in her chest. That night, Helen arrived home later than usual. Julia was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, and immediately noticed that something was different about her mother. "Did something happen at work?" she asked, without looking up from the pot. Helen sat at the small kitchen table, still processing the conversation with Richard. "Julia," she said hesitantly, "do you remember when you were little, and I used to sing to you?" Julia finally looked at her mother, surprised by the question. "Of course I remember. You had a beautiful voice. You still do, by the way. Why do you ask?" Helen fiddled with her hands on the table. "You never wanted to know why I stopped singing." "I always knew why, Mom. You stopped because of me." The simplicity of the answer caught Helen off guard. She had spent years thinking she had hidden her sacrifices from her daughter, but Julia had always known. "I never regretted it," said Helen, quickly. "I know." Julia approached and took her mother's hands. "But that doesn't mean you can't go back to doing what you love." Julia sat down next to her mother. "What happened today? You're different." Helen told about Richard's proposal, about the convention, about the chance to sing again after 15 years of silence. Julia listened silently, and when her mother finished, her eyes were shining. "Mom, you have to accept." "Julia, I haven't sung in 15 years. I don't even know if I can still. We'll find out by trying." That night, for the first time in over a decade, Helen sang out loud. She started timidly, with a trembling and uncertain voice, but as the words flowed, something inside her began to awaken. Julia sat on the couch, listening silently, and when the song ended, She had tears in her eyes. "Mom," she said. Her voice choked. "You need to do this. Not for money, not for recognition, but for yourself. Because that voice can't stay buried." Helen slept little that night. She spent hours staring at the ceiling, remembering the small, cozy stages where she used to perform, the people who stopped their conversations to listen to her, the feeling of completeness she felt when the music flowed through her. It had been a different life, a different Helen, and for years she had managed to convince herself that that woman had died for a good cause. But now, with the possibility of resurrection before her, Helen realized there was a difference between making necessary sacrifices and sacrificing unnecessarily. Julia was grown up, independent, building her own life. Maybe it was time for Helen to reclaim hers. The following morning, she arrived at work with a determination she hadn't felt in years. She finished her usual tasks and waited for Richard to arrive. When she saw him exiting the elevator, she approached, her heart pounding in her chest. "Martinelli," she said, before she could change her mind. He turned, surprised. "Helen. Good morning." About yesterday's proposal, she took a deep breath. "I accept." The smile that spread across Richard's face was genuine and warm. "Seriously, that's wonderful." But Helen raised her hand. "I have a few conditions." Richard nodded, curious. "First, I choose the songs. Second, I need a few days to prepare. And third," she hesitated, "I'd like this to remain between us until the day of the event." "Of course," said Richard. "Anything you need." The next few days flew by. Helen maintained her work routine, but at night she dedicated herself entirely to the music. Julia lent her money to buy a simple but elegant dress, and together they chose the repertoire, March Waters, Corcovado, and as the final song, the Beatles' Imagine, a Portuguese version that Helen had created years ago and had never sung to anyone. Richard, in turn, handled the preparations for the performance with the utmost secrecy. The event program only listed special musical performance without specifying the artist. He had prepared a small stage in the main ballroom of the hotel where the convention would be held, with a piano and soft lighting. On the eve of the event, Helen almost gave up. The reality of what she was about to do hit her with full force. She, a 52-year-old cleaning lady, was going to perform for an audience of powerful executives, people accustomed to the best of everything. What was she thinking? It was Julia who brought her back to reason. "Mom," she said, holding Helen's trembling hands, "do you know what the difference is between you and these executives?" Helen shook her head. "They know how to make money. You know how to touch souls. And in the end, guess which of the two things really matters?" On the night of the event, Helen arrived at the hotel 2 hours before it began. Richard greeted her personally, and for the first time she saw him nervous. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Terrified," she replied honestly. "Great," he said, smiling. "That means you care." The ballroom was filled with elegantly dressed people, conversing in small groups while enjoying canapés and champagne. Helen observed the scene from a discreet corner, wearing her simple black dress and feeling completely out of place. These people lived in a different world from hers, spoke a language she didn't understand, had concerns she could barely imagine. But then she saw something that reassured her. Amidst those powerful and successful people, there was the same human vulnerability she knew so well. There was a young man clearly uncomfortable, in his tuxedo, trying to blend in, but unable to hide his shyness. There was an older woman, who smiled at everyone but whose eyes revealed a deep loneliness. There were tired executives, anxious people, individuals who behind their professional successes were as human and fragile as anyone. And it was at that moment that Helen understood something fundamental. She wasn't there to impress those people. She was there to remind them that they were human. When Richard took the stage to introduce the performance, Helen felt her hands sweating. The room gradually fell silent, and all attention turned to the small stage where she would soon be. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said into the microphone, "tonight we have a very special performance. It's not a celebrity or a world-famous artist. It's something much rarer, a real person, with a real voice, singing songs that touch the real soul." He paused, looking for Helen with his eyes. "I would like to introduce you to Helen Montgomery." The applause was polite, but clearly curious. People didn't know what to expect, and Helen could feel the anticipation, and also the skepticism in the air. She walked onto the stage with trembling legs, approached the microphone, and looked at the audience. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Helen could hear her own breath amplified by the sound system. She could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on her. The temptation to run away was overwhelming. But then she closed her eyes and let the first note escape. It's wood, it's stone, it's the end of the road. The voice that emerged from her was not the same insecure voice from her rehearsals at home. It was a mature voice, laden with years of experience, of pain transformed into wisdom, of love refined by time. It was the voice of a woman who had lived, who had given up, who had sacrificed, and who now offered all of that as a gift to whoever wanted to receive it. The effect was immediate. The side conversations ceased completely. The waiters stopped serving drinks. Even the clinking of cutlery on plates disappeared. Everyone's attention was focused on that simple woman on stage, singing as if she were sharing her soul with every person present. Helen opened her eyes during the second verse and saw something that surprised her tears. There were tears in the eyes of several people in the audience. The shy young executive had stopped trying to hide and looked at her with genuine admiration. The lonely woman smiled through her tears, as if she had found something she didn't know she was looking for. And then Helen saw Richard, standing beside the stage, and understood that he was also crying, not out of pity or embarrassment, but out of pure recognition. He had seen something in her that she herself had forgotten she possessed, and now he was witnessing the rebirth of that before his eyes. The first song ended in absolute silence, then slowly, like a wave, the applause began. It wasn't polite or perfunctory applause, it was sincere, heartfelt applause from people who had been genuinely moved. Helen sang Corcovado next, and then paused. "This last song," she said into the microphone, addressing the audience directly for the first time, "I wrote 15 years ago, but I never had the courage to sing it to anyone. It's about the dreams we keep inside, about the voices we silence, about the importance of not giving up on who we really are." She looked at Richard, then at the audience. "And if you're hearing this story today, if it touched you in some way, I'd like to ask one thing. Don't let life's pressures, responsibilities and fears make you forget your own voices. We all have a song inside us. Don't let it die." And then she sang Imagine, in Portuguese, her own version, transforming John Lennon's Song of Hope into something even more personal and intimate. Her voice grew as the song progressed, filling every corner of the hall, touching every heart present. The silence that followed the final chords was more deafening than any applause Helen had ever received in her life, and at that moment, before an audience of 2,000 standing executives, she finally understood that she had spent 15 years burying the only thing that truly made her feel alive. But the applause that followed was even more powerful. It wasn't just applause, it was a prolonged emotional standing ovation. People who had probably never spoken to each other embraced powerful executives, discreetly wiped away tears. The shy young man applauded fervently, as if he had witnessed a miracle. Richard came on stage and hugged Helen, whispering in her ear, "Thank you for reminding me why music exists." In the weeks that followed, Helen's life changed in ways she hadn't expected. Richard not only kept her at his company, he created a new position for her as employee wellness coordinator, a position that included regular musical performances at company events. The salary was 3 times higher than her cleaning job, but what really mattered to Helen was having her voice back. Julia cried when she heard about her mother's promotion, not only because of the financial change, but because she saw Helen reclaim her lost identity. Mother and daughter began performing together on weekends. Julia discovered she had inherited her mother's musical talent, and her young voice complemented Helen's mature voice perfectly. Richard, in turn, discovered that there was something profoundly transformative about working in a company where art and humanity were valued as much as profits. Employee productivity increased, the work environment became more harmonious, and he began receiving invitations from other companies interested in implementing similar programs. But perhaps the most significant change happened to that shy young executive Helen had noticed in the audience. His name was Gabriel. He was 28 years old, and he worked 70 hours a week at a multinational corporation, sacrificing his health, his relationships, and his dreams in the name of professional success. Helen's performance had impacted him so much that he sought out Richard the day after the event. "I need to know," Gabriel said. "How can I find my own voice?" That's how the Forgotten Voices project was born, an initiative that Helen began to coordinate with Richard. Every month, they organized events where employees from different companies were encouraged to share their hidden talents: executives who painted, secretaries who wrote poetry, security guards who played the guitar, managers who danced. The project quickly spread throughout São Paulo, then throughout Brazil. Helen became a kind of national ambassador for personal rediscovery, traveling the country to talk about the importance of not abandoning our essence in the name of survival. At one of these lectures, 6 months after her first performance, Helen was addressing an audience of 500 people when a young woman in the front row raised her hand. "How did you know when it was time to start singing again?" Helen smiled, remembering herself just a few months before, silently cleaning offices and believing that her dreams had died forever. "I didn't know," she replied. "Honestly. In fact, I spent 15 years convinced it wasn't time. But the truth is, there's never a perfect time. The perfect time is when you decide that your soul matters more than your fears." She paused, looking at the hundreds of attentive faces before her. "You all have a voice. It may be a literal voice, like mine, or it may be a metaphorical voice. Your art, your talent, your unique way of contributing to the world. The important thing is not to let it get lost in the noise of everyday life." After the lecture, dozens of people approached Helen to tell their own stories: an accountant who dreamed of being a chef, a lawyer who wrote children's stories, a taxi driver who composed songs. Each story reinforced her conviction that there were millions of people out there silencing their true vocations in the name of practicality. That night, Helen called Julia, as she did every night during her travels. "How was it today, Mom?" "Transformative," Helen replied. "Every day I understand better that it's not just about music, it's about giving people permission to be who they really are." "And you, who are you really today?" Helen looked out the hotel window, watching the city lights spread to the horizon. "Today I am Helen Montgomery, mother, singer, and a living reminder that it's never too late to start over." 3 years after that first meeting in the office, Richard and Helen stood on the stage of the Chicago Theater, before an audience of 3,000, at the national launch of the Forgotten Voices project. Helen, now 55, had become one of the country's most sought-after speakers, but she had never lost the simplicity that made her so special. "When I was a cleaning lady," she said, into the microphone, eliciting warm laughter from the audience, "I thought my life had become small. Today I know that there's no such thing as a small life, only people who have forgotten how to be big." The applause was warm, but Helen raised her hand, asking for silence. "I want to end this night by singing the same song I sang 3 years ago, when I discovered I still had a voice. But this time I want you to sing with me, because the message I want to leave is simple: you also have a voice, and the world needs to hear it." And then, for the 100th time in those 3 years, but as if it were the first, Helen began to sing March Waters. Only this time, 3,000 voices joined hers, creating an imperfect human real harmony, exactly like life. Richard, watching from the side of the stage, smiled, remembering the morning he first heard that whispered voice in his office. He had started that week thinking only about solving an entertainment problem for his convention. He ended up discovering something far more valuable: that sometimes the greatest transformations come from the most unlikely encounters, from people we think have nothing to teach us. Helen, singing along with thousands of people who had decided not to silence their own voices anymore, finally understood that her journey had never been about abandoning her dreams. It had been about transforming them into something bigger, about discovering that an individual voice can become a choir, that a personal story can become universal, and that it's never too late to remind the world, and ourselves, who we really are when we stop being afraid to shine. That night, when the last chord echoed through the theater, and the applause finally subsided, Helen knew she had found her true calling. It wasn't just singing, it was reminding people that they too could sing. It was being a voice that awakened other voices, a light that lit other lights, living proof that life always offers us a second chance to be who we were born to be. And in the silence that followed that moment of musical communion, Helen finally understood that she hadn't lost 15 years of her life when she stopped singing. She had gained the experience, maturity, and emotional depth necessary for her voice, when it finally returned, to touch not only individual hearts, but to transform entire lives. Sometimes, what seems to be the end is only the beginning of something even more beautiful.